Here is the geography of the land down under, Australia, explained in under 5 minutes. Are you ready? Here we go. The Commonwealth of Australia is a vast country that occupies the entire mainland of the continent of Australia. Sometimes considered to be the world's largest island, Australia is actually a continent in its own right, comprising the mainland, New Guinea to the north, Tasmania to the south, New Zealand, and other nearby archipelagos. It is the smallest, lowest, flattest, driest, and oldest inhabited continent, and it is the only continent whose entire mainland is taken up by just one country. Absolutely the number one thing you have to understand about Australia's geography is that it is huge. It's the world's 6th largest country, larger than India, which has 1.4 billion people. Despite this though, Australia is only the 54th most populous country, home to 27 million people, fewer than countries like Nepal or Madagascar. This makes Australia outrageously sparsely populated, with only about 3 people per square kilometer. For reference, the United States, including Alaska, has 35 people per square kilometer. This still doesn't tell the whole story though, because of those 27 million Australians, 90% of them live in cities along the country's coast that occupy only 0.22% of the country's area. That means that over 99% of Australia is basically empty. 2/3 of Australians live in the country's 5 largest cities alone, with about 40% living in just Sydney and Melbourne. This is one of the highest rates of urbanization of any country in the entire world, and means that although the country has a small population, it still has some massive cities. Sydney and Melbourne each would be the 2nd largest city in the United States, larger than Los Angeles, California, and Brisbane and Perth, Australia's 3rd and 4th largest cities, are more populous than Houston, Texas. That means that you can think of Australia as more of an archipelago than a continent, with each of these red dots being its own little island of civilization separated by hundreds or thousands of miles of uninhabited wilderness. Speaking of that land, Australia is not particularly diverse considering its sheer size, but nonetheless, it has several distinct regions. The country's largest and most important mountain range is this area in brown, the Great Dividing Range, which at over 2,000 miles long is the longest mountain range in the world to be within one country. This range separates the highly populated eastern section of the country, with major cities like Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, from the rest, as well as providing water for most of the major rivers of the country. This is also where Australia's capital and largest inland city sits, Canberra, neutrally located right between Sydney and Melbourne, and directly north of the country's highest mountain range, the Snowy Mountains, where all of Australia's highest peaks can be found, including the highest, Mount Kosciuszko, at only 7,300 feet. This is the lowest high point of any continent, and in fact is not even the highest point in the country of Australia. That honor would go to the volcanic Mawson Peak on Heard Island, a distant uninhabited island territory in Antarctica that stands at over 9,000 feet tall. Australia controls several of these overseas islands that all in give the country the world's 3rd largest ocean territory. South of the Great Dividing Range and across the Bass Strait is where the country's largest island can be found, Tasmania, which is its own state and shares a similar climate and landscape to the southeastern portion of the mainland. Heading back to the mainland, as we travel down the western slopes of the mountain, we enter the Murray-Darling River Basin, the longest and largest in the country, supporting a huge portion of Australia's agriculture industry. Thanks in part to this river, Australia has the most farmable land per capita of any country in the world. But outside of this river basin, the rest of the country's interior is conspicuously empty, all the way up until you reach a narrow strip of habitable land along the western coast, where the 4th largest city, Perth, sits. The vast and uninhabited interior of Australia is known as the Outback, and is home to only 600,000 people, making it one of the world's largest and most intact natural areas. And although it's famously mostly desert, there are swamps, forests, and mountains here as well, including the most famous mountain in the country, Uluru, a sandstone monolith rising 1,000 feet above the surrounding desert. And the country's largest lake, Lake Eyre, a massive saline basin containing the country's lowest point, about 50 feet below sea level. Politically speaking, Australia is divided into 6 states and 2 territories, the largest of which, Western Australia, is the 2nd largest national subdivision in the world. It would be the world's 10th largest country if it were independent, and yet it has a smaller population than Jamaica. Australia also claims to control a significant portion of the continent of Antarctica, however this is internationally disputed. Australia has an extremely developed economy with the world's 13th largest GDP, giving it the 10th largest GDP per capita. The largest industry is mining, and Australia is a top 5 producer of iron, coal, and gold. The country has one of the world's largest immigrant populations, the most endemic reptile species of any country, and the world's largest coral reef. Aussies, comment down below how I did, and everybody else, let me know where I should go next. Thanks for watching. Follow for more.